Welcome everyone to another session that we're running this week. So Cosmos DB and Azure Functions with Johan. So thank you for joining us again, Johan. This is the second session that you've presented in the last couple of weeks to us. So I really appreciate you coming and sharing your knowledge with us again. Always quite popular and interesting topics. So very appreciative. Thank you. This is the last session that we're running with the learning rooms currently as they are. So at the moment, the Microsoft Learning Rooms are a Teams-based community where this is how you've found the sessions for those who've joining live. It's part of the Teams, but the Teams tenant is essentially getting cold at the end of this month. So that's June 2025. What we're doing instead is we're moving the learning rooms to Microsoft Learn. So if you haven't already seen the link, go to Microsoft Learn, search for Tech Community, search for Microsoft Learn, and then under the groups section, it's a bit hidden there, but under the groups, you should be able to see a list of all the learning rooms that are transitioning across to this to the tech community environment. And as you can see there, Azure Cloud Command is the one that I'm running is there. So they are closed groups, so you need to click on them, request access to it. Someone like myself will go in and approve access, and then that's where you'll see future events and hopefully get some discussion going. So just a thought on that. But unfortunately, the TeamSpace environment is closing, so this is the last session on behalf of that, but we will be running more sessions. They'll just be in the learning room instead. So this session is being recorded, so if you come off mute or enable your camera, just be aware of that. So anything you say will be recorded, so no commercial information or information on customers, just be aware that that will be captured. But the chat won't be, so I'll be monitoring the chat throughout, but voice and video will be recorded. So if you don't consent to being recorded, then please disconnect your line. The attendees' names are hidden from the recording anyway. This is an inclusive session to just be respectful to everyone. Everyone's coming from different areas. Some may have been using this technology for a while. Some may have only learnt of its existence today. People coming from different backgrounds as well. So yeah, we're all here to learn. We're all here to hopefully have fun along the way. So yeah, all's welcome. So I'd just like to do an introduction to our speaker today. So Johan, Microsoft MVP in .NET DevOps and also a Microsoft certified trainer. It's the second time that he's come and presented to us today. So really appreciate you coming, joining, sharing your knowledge with us all. Yeah, take it away. Really looking forward to this. Thank you for coming.
Okay, more than welcome. Okay, let's get started. I will start sharing my screen and push out PowerPoint. Let's see if window, yes.
Will the tech gods be with us today?
Yeah, definitely, because we are working with Azure, so I did do my prayers that everything went okay, will go okay. Okay, what are we going to talk about? Azure Functions and Cosmos DB. Well, I'm not quite sure if everyone is familiar with what Azure Functions are all about and Cosmos DB is all about. So I'll start off with a simple introduction of both, and then we start checking how we can use Cosmos DB and Azure Functions together, because I do love both products, and it would be great if we do get a good integration with them. Okay, but let's check. If we are talking about Azure Functions, what are we talking about? Well, Azure Functions are an implementation of a serverless function. And serverless functions do come with all cloud vendors. And for Azure, that's called the Azure Functions. And what's so specific about it, you don't need any infrastructure, at least. You don't need to specify it. Of course, it will run an infrastructure, but it will take you the least amount of effort to configure it. That's activated by a trigger, and that trigger can be a lot of things. It can be an HTTP call. It can be a timer event. It can be something happening on a queue. It can be something happening in a database. Azure Functions come with bindings, input and output bindings, and we will see them. And it's a great way to start building a microservices architecture, where you can even use automated workflows that do provide automatic scalability. There's one thing that you really should take into account: the execution time that you can have for an Azure function that is limited. And I did say, well, it's limited if you use the durable functions, which is a bit of an exception to that. You can make them long running, but normally if you have a long running process that will run for multiple minutes, Azure Functions is not your thing. Okay. And then what about Cosmos DB? Well, Cosmos DB is a great scalable database solution, and it does support multiple database models. So you can put in a document database, you can put in a graph database, a colon-oriented database. But what's very important, it is not a relational database. So if you have a domain where you really need the relations within your database, Cosmos DB is not the way to go. Yes, you can mimic it. Yes, you can misuse Cosmos DB to actually behave a bit like a relational database, but you won't get the benefits of it. Okay, but why would I use Cosmos? Well, it's quite low latency because it's globally distributed. There's good consistency options because of the distribution. You also have to specify what you want to do if you, for instance, update a document. And one of the cool things I really like about Cosmos DB, it can be a very cheap solution. I do some voluntary work for some charities next to my normal job, and those charities don't have a lot of money. And the combination that I'm going to show you now, I can build quite a cheap solution with Azure Functions and with Cosmos together, so that I can even use Azure as a great hosting platform for a real charity without that it really costs them a lot of money. Okay. What are we going to do? Well, I always like to have a presentation and that we do cover a specific domain. Well, for this presentation, I chose events. Why is that? Next to me being a developer and me sharing knowledge, I also am a first aid provider, a medical first aid provider at events in the Netherlands. And I do work for a charity as well that is simply being hired to guard certain events. And if we are talking about events, then we do need to store certain things. Well, a very limited view of what we are going to use is we do have an event, and events normally are split up in shifts because an event can last 12, 16 hours and you don't want to work that amount of time as a volunteer. So this is what we're going to do. We are going to build an Azure function together with Cosmos DB to manage those two. Okay. I think that I've talked enough through PowerPoint. Let's dive into some code. Okay, so I'll head over to Visual Studio. And I hope you're all a bit familiar with Visual Studio, but we won't cover a lot. Okay, what I've done is I have created 3 different implementations of an Azure function already. Why did I do that? I don't want to waste time creating projects, adding references. I will show you what dependencies you need, but I'm not going to create projects. And by the way, all the code that I show you is available on my GitHub, so you can always afterwards look at the code and even copy it if you want to. Okay, what is present in every function? Well, for starters, there's a model. And in my models, I have my first state event with a lot of things, and I've got my shift. Nothing special, just some properties inside the first state event with a list of shifts. And I have my function. And by convention, I chose to simply use the HTTP trigger because I want this function to be callable from the outside. Okay. What I didn't do is put some authorization on it. Yes, you can, and it's easy to integrate it, but it would take away the concepts that I want to show you. Okay, so this is the code that we're starting to work with. Okay, that's the Azure Functions part. But what about the Cosmos DB part? Well, let's take a look at it. I have got here my Cosmos DB that I created for this session. And what you can see, there are a lot of information here. I can do networking, CQRS. So there's a lot of things that I can do, but I can also go for the Data Explorer because there are a few things that I really want to show you in Cosmos before we start connecting to Cosmos with code. The first thing is I've got a database, event planning. And within that database, I have got a container. And that container contains items. So compare it a bit to a relational database where you have your database, where you have your tables, and then you have your rows. Same goes here. I've got my database, I've got my container, and within that, I've got my items. And for this presentation, I chose simply to start using a document database. What you can also see is there's a concept around stored procedures. There's a concept around user-defined functions. There's a concept around triggers. I haven't implemented these for this demo, but if you are quite familiar with, for instance, SQL Server or any other relational database, you can see that these are present here and are present in a relational database. So Cosmos DB is really a very mature database if you want to use it. Okay, let's start writing some code. Because in the presentation, I already told you there is a thing called input and output bindings. Well, let's first start using that one. So I've got my project attribute based, and I am really going to use an attribute to do that. So what I'm going to do is I am going to introduce a parameter here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to decorate that with simply an attribute. And that attribute is Cosmos DB input, where I supply the database name, the container name, like we saw in the portal. I specify the connection, and I specify the query to use. And if you look at this, this really looks like normal, regular relational SQL. So if you're coming from a SQL Server background or another relational database, you can really get quite fast accustomed to this one. What you will see is that I do put a condition here, but it's not that this is by default in Cosmos DB, but I chose this code comes from a bigger solution, and I chose never to throw away an event. So that's why I introduced a field called isDeleted, so that I can simply soft delete everything. But if I want to get the actual events, I don't want the deleted ones. Okay, where does the connection come from? Well, I did put that in local settings JSON. And please, 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 in a normal real world scenario, don't put this in a settings JSON. Put this in a secrets file, put this in Azure Vault, put this somewhere safe. If you are going to use local settings JSON, it's fine, but please don't commit it to your source control. Keep it on your local machine. Okay. I've got this input binding. Let's simply say, well, I'm going to return that one. So what I'm going to do is simply return the events. So it gets input and I simply return it. Let's see what happens if I start this one. We just have to wait for Visual Studio to build. This always takes a bit of time, especially because we are running over Teams. Just wait for it a bit. Okay, restoring.
Yeah, I remember you making a comment on the last session around how the Visual Studio Code does have a bit of a delay with Teams sharing, at least.
Yeah, I really notice normally when I start sharing my screen and through a team session, I really notice a delay in the performance of Visual Studio. So don't think that Visual Studio is slow if you're coming from, for instance, a Visual Studio Code background. It's not slow, but Teams does slow it a bit down. Okay. Function is now running. What I'll simply now do is simply go to good old Postman. If you have done anything with API testing, you probably have some familiarity with Postman, a great tool to start testing your APIs with. So what I'm going to do is I am going to open up the attributes called getAllEvents, because that's all it's going to do. It's going to hit this endpoint, and the endpoint that we can see, that's one here, the 7219er. Okay, if I send it, what will happen? Information from my database will be retrieved, and that will take a bit of time. And what you will see is I have a 200 OK, and my information gets returned. Okay, great. So a great solution, but I also like clean coding. I am also a test-driven developer. And this is great, a lot less code, but it's pretty hard for me to start actually testing this. And not in this case, because this is quite an easy case. But if you have a more complex query, I normally really want to test it. And this setup doesn't allow me to do so. But it's a lot less code. And yes, you can do some integration testing on it, of course. Okay. What is a different approach? Like any Microsoft product, or every Microsoft product, we normally have a client attached to it. That's simply shipped with the product. Same goes with Cosmos DB. So if I go to my dependencies and if I go to my packages, you will see here Microsoft Azure.cosmos. That's actually the Cosmos client that I can use to talk to Cosmos DB. Okay, what I've done in this project is something different. I already started preparing it so that I could test it in the future. So what did I do? I introduced a service, and that service will be used by the event, by the function, so that I get separation of concerns. Okay, but if I want to do that, of course I do need this Cosmos client, and I can simply inject it. But if you are going to work with the client, you're not interested in the client itself, you're interested in the container. Because like I mentioned, you have the database, you have the container, and all the items are stored in the container. So if I want to do anything with my Cosmos DB database, I have to do it through the container. Okay. And what I want to do, I really want to fetch all the events. So Instead of putting it in an attribute, I now put it in a query definition. I simply ask the container to get an iterator for the item query, pass in the type that I want to return, and then I can simply iterate through the result and pass it back to the function. This setup is really checking if I only have first 8 event documents in my database, which is not always true, because a document database provides no structure. So I could put different documents, different document types inside my same container. Well, if I really wanted to do that, I do have a different option. I could simply go for the get and the item query stream iterator. So if I really have multiple document types within the same database, or within the same container, of course, then I can't go for the get item query iterator with the generic. I simply could go for the get item query stream iterator and then do the determination what kind of document I am working with on my own. Okay, but we'll leave that one out. I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do is I am going to add a different method in this service class, and that's simply a way to fetch an event based on its ID. Because what will this allow me to do? If I now go to my Azure function, I can say, well, you know what? I want to inject this service. And if I want to inject this service, that will mean that I will have to register it with my builder. And what happens now? I pass in the connection string. And what have I done in this setup is I've already taken into account the local situation with the double colon. Or if I want to put it in an environment variable in Azure, I must use the one with the underscore. Then I can simply create my client, pass it through my first 8 event service, and hook them up like that. Okay. That will mean that if I go to this function, that I can use the function, the service, in 2 different ways. Because what I wanted to show you is in an Azure function, I can also pass arguments. So I'll simply pass in an ID, or I can pass in an ID, and I'll simply check if it's not null, then I'll simply call the by ID, and otherwise I simply get the regular one. Okay, great. Let's see what happens if I simply use this one. So I'm going to run this one. And if I haven't messed up, then it will simply run it. Just wait for it a bit. Taking a bit less time now. Okay, it's running. So I go to my client, get all events. And I simply say, well, go. And we wait until we do get the same result again. Great. So with this setup, I do get a better understanding, or it will help me a lot to generate code that is more easily testable. Okay, and what I'll do, I'll simply shut these 2 down, just to be sure. Okay, but there's still a different thing that I want to show you, because a lot of developers that start using Cosmos DB come from a relational background. And if you are talking about .NET, C# and relational databases, a lot of people simply say, well, okay, then you have to use EF Core. You don't have to, but it is a de facto standard. So yes, you probably will have some experience using EF Core. Well, EF Core is able to work with Cosmos DB as well. So let's see how we can do that. To get that to work, I do need to add a package, and that's called Microsoft Entity Framework Core.cosmos. And because it's Entity Framework, I do have to specify a context. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to specify a context for my event. And if you are a bit familiar with EF Core, we simply use the DB set. I simply say, well, I want the first date event. Perfect. Okay, what I chose in this scenario is to configure it in my unconfiguring. Yes, you could put in the DB context options, which would be a good alternative. But the specific thing is here in the onModel creating, because we do have to do some different things compared to EF Core in a relational setup. For starters, I have to specify what the default container is, so that if I don't provide a container, that at least Entity Framework knows which container to address. What I didn't mention yet is that Cosmos uses a partition key to split up the different slices of data. And you do set the partition key when you create the database. And you do have to specify the partition key in a number of operations. And I can show you that because I didn't show you exactly. But if we go back to our previous solution, you will see that, did I specify it here? Yeah, there it is. Here's my partition key. So in the client, I used the partition key already, but I didn't mention it yet to you. The partition key is quite important, so that's why I do have to specify it if I want to use EF Core. And this is a specific one, has no discriminator. I already showed you in the client approach that multiple document types can be present in one container. If Entity Framework wants to distinguish between them, he has to use some kind of discriminator. Well, since we only have one type of document inside the container, I specified here has no discriminator. You can compare it a bit if you have used Entity Framework Core for the table per type, table per hierarchy. If you put in the table per hierarchy, information will have to be added to the database, to the table, which concrete type is stored. That same applies for the discriminator. And for the rest, it simply puts the shifts in an ownership relationship. And this is probably quite familiar for most Entity Framework Core users. Simply specify a value generator. But unless, or in difference to what is quite normal in a relational database, that you use, for instance, a long as the primary key, in Cosmos DB, by convention, you have to use an ID, and that ID has the type of GUID. So that's why I use a GUID value generator. We haven't inserted anything yet, but I've set it up already. Okay. And if I want to do that, I can simply go to my function now. I can inject my context. But before I can actually start using it, I have to register it. So because I haven't used the options version, I can simply say, well, okay, add context, and that's it. How can I use this? Well, quite easily. I simply pick up the context, the events, and put them to list. Okay. Let's simply check what this will look like. So we're going to run it again. See how fast it is this time. It's fast enough. Looks good. Yep, it started. So I go back to Postman and I simply say, well, okay, you know what? I am going for the EF core, send it, and then I do expect. What's wrong? Why doesn't it work? View in console. Host lock acquired for. This is the problem if you start using different functions within the same solution. You do have to start the right one. Sorry for that. Fortunately, it's quite easily fixable. Double check if it's running. Secrets file config. Yep, and now I can run it. And I do see that the endpoint is getting hit. And there is my information. Perfect. Great. So a good way to reuse your existing knowledge about Entity Framework. But we're not there yet, because an API is of course quite useful, but only fetching information is probably not the thing that we always want to do. So how can I add information to Cosmos from within an Azure function? Okay, we're going all the way back to our attribute-based approach. So we did have an input binding here. Well, if there's an input binding, there's also an output binding. So what we're going to do, I'm going to add a method called addEvent. And I have to add the attribute, this time not in the argument list, but I have to put it above the method. And I specify almost the same things that my database name, my container name, and the connection. Or I have to specify extra, what do I want to do if the container doesn't exist? Well, I leave it to false because I really like to simply make sure that I create everything that I need within Azure, that I do know that all the correct options are specified. Okay, I get the information passed as part of my HTTP request in the body. So I do have to deserialize it. I already told you there's an ID, but there's no GUID gen here because we're simply using the output binding. So I do have to come up with my own new GUID and I return it. And this one will be caught by the output and stored in the database. So let's see if I simply run it. Just wait for it. Yeah, great. So what I'm going to do is in the body, I specify a new event with empty shifts. And I simply say add. I did it again. Sorry for that. Attribute based. Just waiting. By the way, while we're still waiting, there are some options if you like, for instance, Aspire to start working with Aspire if you are using Azure Functions. There is some support for it yet, so if you really want to do that, it will take away a lot of the switching that I have to do right now. Okay, and if I go back to Postman, I'll simply repost my request. And if I didn't do it now correctly, I will get a 200 OK. But I don't get anything in my response body. That's the downside of using this approach, because the output, this one is caught by the output, is stored in the database, but that's why it doesn't get an HTTP response that you can see the actual resource being created. Okay. What can we do with DB client? Well, of course, we do have to start with the event service first. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a method to my service. And all I'm going to do is simply the same as we did with the attribute, assign a new ID and put it in the container. One thing that I really like about the client is that you can, for instance, use this one, upsert in item. So I could make a method, simply add or insert or update an event, push it in, use this method, and Cosmos will figure it out. If it's an item that it already has, it will update it, and otherwise it will insert it. So you can see that the client approach is really quite native and well aligned with all the things that Cosmos DB support. Okay, if I now go to my function, all I do is simply say, well, you know what? I'll simply go into edit, and just as I did before, I read it from the JSON. I did do some checking here to just for sanity, and I add it through the service. Okay, now start up the correct one, because I don't want to go into a 500 error again because it's not running. Just wait. Okay, it's coming online. Yep, there it is. And what I'm going to do is I am going to add it through the event. Going to send it. And now you do see that the function is adding. I do nicely get the generated resource returned. Okay. Nice. But what about entity framework? Well, I am using a context, so events already knows how to add things. So I don't need to do anything in my context. So I can go to my event service and I can simply say, well, you know what? I am going to add the event by simply adding it to my events, and it's entity framework. So I do have to call the save changes. Okay. And if I do this one and I run this one, let's see what happens. Just having to wait. It is running, of course, now multiple services. I'm quite curious. That's what I thought. Not running it through a debugger is quite nice, but it will keep the process open, so that it will lock actually the port. Okay. Wait for it. Storage connection string invalid. No, it's not, because it's simply, let's go to this one, go to EF call, and simply say, send it. See what happens. It does take a bit of time. I do get 200 OK, and I do get the resource. OK, so Entity Framework Core was able to add the resource to Cosmos. OK. What did I do? I added it through a binding, through my client, and to EF. OK. So if I now go to the client back, and I fetch all the information, and of course I do have to run it. I did client-based, simply run it again. Double check, yep, it's running. And if I now do this, it will start executing, and I will get all the events returned. If I now do the same with my EF core version, and I do have to check if is it still running. Let's double check. It's the 7016. Nope, so I do have to run it. Will it? Oh, it is running. Okay. Watch what will happen. $500 internal server error. What did happen? This is really the downside of using EF Core to access Cosmos, to access a non-relational database. Non-relational means there's no relation, there's no schema enforced. And by using the binding, by using the client, I can insert documents that I get a 200 OK for, so that Cosmos says, well, it's just fine, but that don't adhere any more strictly to the schema that Entity Framework needs to enforce. And yes, you can tune Entity Framework to skip things that are not present. So you can simply change the serialization. But this is something that you should be aware of, that if you use EF Core for Cosmos, and you have a different clients that can add documents to the database, that you really must take care that you are quite fierce on how it will work with missing data. Okay. There's one thing that I do want to show you. And we've talked a lot about getting data out of Cosmos, putting data into Cosmos. But there's one cool thing that you can do with the combination between Azure Function and Cosmos DB. And that's all got to do with triggers. Because what I can do is I can use an Azure function with a Cosmos DB trigger. So I can specify that I want to listen to changes in my events within event planning using this connection. And it uses a lease container name for that to store the changes. But what will happen if I start this one? Let's simply check. And do remember, we inserted already some documents in our database. Let's simply run it. Okay, work process started. The function is getting, and what do we see? Well, all the events are in Dutch, but you do see that there are 3 events that were added through our functions that have been part of the lease and that get produced after I boot up the function. But it's not just that I can say, well, I'm going to boot up the function. Let's double check, because I still have my EF call running. So if I resend this at, and if I double check, you will see that it will appear here as well. So that's what I mean. You can build connected systems using Cosmos, using Azure Functions, because you can determine what you want to do, or what needs to be done, if a document gets added to Cosmos DB. Okay, a lot of ground covered. So let's go back to and come to a bit of a conclusion. If we look at the different approaches, attribute-based, it's fast, it requires very little code, but the big downside is the testability is quite limited. If you look at separation of concerns, everything is in the function. But then again, it can be a good choice if there is simply limited functionality. The CosmosClient, I hope I've shown you that's a very good fit for the database model, that you can do a lot with the client that really neatly fits the support that Cosmos DB has. It does require a bit more code, but you will get better testability, you will get better separation of concerns. And of course, EF Core. Great if you want to reuse your existing knowledge that you have in EF. But please do remember, Cosmos DB is not a relational database. And EF Core, if you don't use it wisely, will push you into a situation where you think it will be a relational database. So please reuse your existing knowledge, but be careful of what you do. Because, like I showed you, small errors in a document can cause a server error, and you don't really want to have that in production. Okay. That's what I wanted to show you today. If you want to get in touch with me, these are my socials. I'll simply stop sharing, because then we can actually start checking if we've got any questions coming from the chat, and it will make it easier for me to watch you.
And I'm on mute. So that was great. Thank you very much. I did share this link as in the chat as well. So
Oh, great.
there is a Microsoft Azure Architecture Center document on non-relational databases and NoSQL. So it actually goes through explaining like the document data stores and things like that. So definitely look that up if you're interested in that. Thank you very much for presenting today. There was a question in the chat around the function codings and the endpoint. So for example, in your demo, you had events and some other endpoints as well. And the question was around, okay, well, localhost/API/events, is that essentially an endpoint? Can you have the multiple endpoints and methods in your code in the one function app, for example? And I answered that yes, you could have multiple endpoints in the one function app code based on the route that you're being set as well. So
yeah, definitely. It in that aspect, it really looks like you have a normal API project with ASP.NET. Routing will solve a lot for you.
that was great. Any last questions, anyone? Johan, if anyone wanted to know more, where would you go? What would you recommend for either Cosmos database or Azure Functions? What resources would you recommend to those who want to learn more?
Okay. It looks a bit strange, of course, but I
Mhm.
really, really, really recommend Microsoft Learn. There's some
Yeah.
good modules on both Azure Functions and Cosmos DB with some exercises that you can start playing around with it. So if you really want to get started with either and you don't know, okay, how can I do it? That's really an authoritative source, and it's closely monitored with Microsoft personnel, but also by the community, that if things are wrong, that they will get corrected. And
Mhm.
yes, there is of course also some great resources that you can find on YouTube, blogs and things like that. But Azure Functions and Cosmos are quite in development. So things that might be true or may have been true 2 years ago may not be true today. So Microsoft Learn is always up to date. So
Yeah.
if you want to learn it from Microsoft Learn or a different source, do check the date when it was published. Because especially for around Azure Functions had a different runtime setting
Mm.
years ago. And if you want to use that nowadays, and you do follow along with code samples from back then, you will fail.
Yeah. I guess
And
that's true for a lot of cloud technologies as well.
definitely.
Start with the base first party Microsoft Learn documentation, build up that knowledge, then go out to other third party resources, and you know what you then know what you don't know, and so you're more targeted in the areas that you need to investigate. I think if I remember rightly, Cosmos DB and Azure Functions are also part of the Azure Developer 204 exam. So if you're looking at getting certified, potentially that's the one for you as well.
Definitely. If you want, of course, if you got the AZ900, it's
Mm,
simply really an overview. If you really want to start developing on Azure, the 204 exam, I really would recommend. It's a tough exam. I know I've had to do it twice to pass it. It's a real tough exam. You do have to have some experience playing around with the different Azure resources. So if you go for that one, I would say please do, but do prepare well and make sure that you not only read the documentation, but that you also start playing around with the different Azure resources so that you know how to use them on your exam, because otherwise your exam will really be quite tough.
yeah. There's no other questions, but thank you very much for coming and presenting to us today.
You're welcome.
Definitely. Do you want us to just share your contact slide again, and we'll end on that just
Yeah,
for
sure.
those who want to reach out?
I'll
And
simply.
yeah, so make sure you check out Johan, connect with him. His GitHub repo has all the repositories that you could ever want to play around with some of the stuff. So I haven't checked out your YouTube yet, but I'll be doing that shortly. But
Okay, that's a good one. The top one is in Dutch, so
oh yeah,
probably for international people,
yeah.
it will be quite difficult. I did want to do that because as a teacher, as a former teacher, I noticed that sometimes explaining certain concepts in your native language is sometimes a bit easier for a person to
Mm.
grasp. The bottom one is in English, so that's usable for everyone all around the world.
That's great. And to be frank, I mean, even when we come across languages that we don't like, it's not a first party language. We've got the technology now to translate it. So yeah,
Definitely.
it still doesn't hide the invaluable resource for the rest of us who don't understand that language. So I'll plead ignorance and use the AI tools to do my translation
Great.
for me. So but yeah, thank you very much for presenting. Thank you all the attendees for joining and the questions that you've had during the chat. We'll end here, but yeah, thank you.